The set was pristine, the lighting perfect, and the audience was already buzzing in anticipation for another high-profile interview on This Week with George Stephanopoulos. Tonight, they had Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director, sitting across from the host. A Hollywood icon whose career spanned decades, Eastwood's reputation for grit and resilience was known worldwide. At 94, he still commanded attention the moment he stepped onto a stage, carrying with him the weight of a lifetime's work. Stephanopoulos greeted him with his usual charm, flashing his trademark smile as the cameras rolled. It was meant to be just another promotional segment, a quick chat about Eastwood's new documentary, Real American Heroes. On paper, it was supposed to be a straightforward discussion about the ordinary people who do extraordinary things, firefighters, teachers, soldiers, true heroes that Eastwood had long admired. The crowd cheered as Eastwood settled into the chair, exuding an air of calm confidence, a man who had been in front of the camera countless times before, but always with purpose. But beneath the rehearsed smiles and polite applause, something was different tonight. Clint Eastwood's eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the room. He wasn't just observing the set, he was reading the room, his instincts honed over decades of navigating not just Hollywood's glitz but also its darker corners. There was an energy in the air that didn't sit right with him. It wasn't the usual friendly banter he'd come to expect. Stephanopoulos, for all his skill, seemed to be shifting gears early, subtly altering the tone. As they began discussing the documentary, George played his usual role of the interviewer, polite, calm, and always with a question at the ready. But the questions tonight were laced with something else. Stephanopoulos began to prod, ever so gently, with a comment about the nature of heroism in the modern world. In today's political climate, he ventured, don't you think a message like that could be seen as exclusionary? The word exclusionary hung in the air, sharp and uninvited. It was the first spark, a subtle nudge that Eastwood didn't expect. He had dealt with the press for years, often having to answer questions that tried to drag him into political debates. But this felt different. This wasn't just an inquiry into the documentary, it was a challenge. Eastwood didn't flinch. His answer came slow, measured. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, George," he said, keeping his voice calm, but the words carried weight. This wasn't a man who would be pushed into a corner by a simple question. He'd been in standoffs before, both on screen and off, and he knew exactly how to hold his ground. For a brief moment, the air in the studio felt thick, as if the entire room held its breath. The cameras, the lights, the audience, all of it seemed irrelevant for a heartbeat. What was unfolding wasn't just an interview, it was a quiet battle for control. Clint Eastwood wasn't just here to promote a documentary. He was here to protect something far more valuable, his integrity. The tension was subtle, but unmistakable. Stephanopoulos wasn't done. His next question would test how far Eastwood was willing to let this go. What was supposed to be a friendly conversation had already begun to shift into something far more uncomfortable. The storm was brewing, and it was clear that tonight's interview wouldn't be like any other. The air in the studio had already shifted, but Clint Eastwood, ever the stoic, remained unshaken. Stephanopoulos, sensing the subtle resistance, pushed forward with a calculated shift in his questioning. The polite smile never left his face, but there was a growing edge to his voice, one that made it clear he wasn't content with just discussing Clint's latest project. The documentary, Real American Heroes, wasn't the only topic on the table anymore. Now, it was about the politics of heroism, and more importantly, Clint's personal views. "So, Clint," Stephanopoulos began, his voice measured but laced with an undeniable challenge, "your documentary focuses on people who serve selflessly, firefighters, soldiers, teachers. But in today's climate, don't you think some might see this kind of message as exclusionary? The idea of who is considered a hero could leave out a lot of people." The word exclusionary hit the air with the precision of a well-aimed shot. It was a subtle jab, one that most wouldn't immediately catch, but Eastwood, ever the sharp observer, recognized it for what it was, a direct challenge. Stephanopoulos wasn't just asking about the documentary anymore. He was probing, looking for cracks in Eastwood's decades-long career and reputation. Eastwood's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with that all-too-familiar awareness, the same look he'd given countless adversaries before. His response was calm, controlled, and carried that unmistakable weight of years lived both on screen and in the public eye. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, George," he said, his voice steady, But there was a trace of something beneath the surface, a hint that he knew exactly what this was about. The audience, who had been quietly absorbing the conversation, now sat a little straighter, sensing that something more than a simple interview was unfolding. The question wasn't just about the documentary. It was an opening, a thinly veiled attempt to engage in a political debate. Eastwood wasn't interested in playing that game, and it showed. Stephanopoulos, undeterred, pressed on. His next words were smoother, more deliberate. Of course, but some might argue that your definition of heroism leaves out certain people. You've been known to voice strong opinions on some political figures, movements that fight for equality. Don't you think that complicates your view on what it means to be a hero? There it was. The true challenge had arrived, not just about Eastwood's film, but about his personal political stances. The word complicated was the key here, an accusation in itself that implied Eastwood's views were divisive, perhaps even outdated. For a moment, Clint's face remained unreadable. He was the master of controlling his expressions, but his jaw tightened just enough to signal that the question had hit closer to the bone than anyone in the room expected. Yet, he didn't rush to answer. Instead, he let the silence linger, giving the question the weight it deserved. "I've got opinions, sure," Clint said finally, his voice still steady. "So does everyone. But that doesn't change what the documentary is about. It's about people who step up when others step back. Teachers, firefighters, soldiers, people doing what's right when no one's watching. That's what I'm talking about when I speak of heroes." For most, that would have been the end of the discussion. A clear, definitive answer that connected the dots. But Stephanopoulos wasn't done yet. He leaned forward again, his eyes gleaming with a mix of curiosity and challenge. It was no longer about heroes. It was about Eastwood himself. And with that shift, the tension in the room skyrocketed. The duel had begun. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a guest. He was now a target, and Stephanopoulos was determined to see how far he could push him. The tension in the studio was palpable. What began as a routine celebrity interview had now evolved into something much deeper, an ideological clash. Clint Eastwood, despite his decades of experience in front of the cameras, wasn't just defending his film anymore. He was defending his entire legacy, his beliefs, and the values that had shaped his career. On the other side of the table, George Stephanopoulos, a seasoned journalist known for his probing questions, was now pushing Eastwood into a corner, testing how far he could go without breaking the man who had long been synonymous with American toughness. Stephanopoulos, sensing the subtle shift in power, decided to take things further. "Clint," he began, his voice smooth but with an underlying sharpness, "you've had your fair share of controversial moments in the past, especially regarding your political views. You've made statements that have upset a lot of people. When you say things like that, doesn't it change the way people see you as a figure of heroism?" The question wasn't just about Clint's film anymore. It was a direct strike at his character, an attempt to discredit his entire narrative of what it meant to be a hero. The word controversial hung in the air, loaded with implications. Stephanopoulos wasn't asking about Eastwood's art or his storytelling anymore. He was asking about his personal opinions, about his right to speak freely, and about how those views might undermine his status as an icon. Clint Eastwood didn't flinch. His face remained stoic, unmoved by the sharpness in Stephanopoulos' voice. The camera zoomed in on him, capturing every small movement, every flicker of emotion. But Clint didn't give an inch. He was a man who had faced down much worse than this, both in front of the camera and in his personal life. "Look, George," Clint said slowly, choosing his words with the precision of a seasoned director delivering a line, "I've never claimed to be perfect. I'm not asking anyone to agree with everything I say or do. I'm a storyteller. I share what I believe, but it's up to the audience to take it however they see fit. But that doesn't mean I'm going to back down from what I believe just because it doesn't fit someone else's narrative." The studio went quiet. There was no nervous laughter, no polite applause. It was as if the entire room had collectively held its breath, waiting for Stephanopoulos' next move. But Stephanopoulos wasn't done. He leaned forward again, pushing Clint into even more uncomfortable territory. "But Clint, when you publicly support certain controversial figures, when you make light of political movements, doesn't that make your message about heroism harder to believe? Doesn't it make you part of the problem?" Eastwood's expression darkened, but his voice remained unwavering. I don't get to pick who the heroes are. I make movies about people who do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not because it's popular. It doesn't matter who you support or where you stand. What matters is how you show up when it counts. That's what makes someone a hero." It was a masterstroke. Clint wasn't just deflecting. He was redirecting the conversation back to where it belonged, on the values of selflessness, integrity, and personal responsibility. He wasn't interested in entertaining the politics of the moment. He was sticking to his guns, and in doing so, he took back control of the conversation. For a moment, Stephanopoulos appeared taken aback, caught off guard by Clint's resolve. The host had been expecting a more defensive answer, perhaps an apology or an attempt to explain away his views. But Clint wasn't going to offer any of that. He wasn't here to justify himself to anyone. The audience, sensing the shift, grew quieter. The power dynamic in the room had officially changed. Clint Eastwood had turned the tables, and Stephanopoulos, despite his polished professionalism, had momentarily lost his grip on the interview. This was no longer just a conversation about Clint's new film. It was a duel of ideals, a clash between an established legend and a host determined to tear down his carefully constructed image. As the silence stretched on, it became clear that Clint wasn't just fighting for his career or his film. He was fighting for something much bigger, the right to speak his truth without being painted into a corner by the media. And in that moment, it was Clint who had the upper hand. The studio had grown cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of the audience's initial enthusiasm. The polite smiles, the calculated small talk, everything was gone now. What had started as a simple promotional interview had turned into a fierce ideological battle. Clint Eastwood, 94 years old and unbroken, wasn't backing down. And George Stephanopoulos, ever the probing journalist, wasn't willing to let up either. But what Stephanopoulos failed to understand in that moment was that Clint Eastwood wasn't just a guest. He was a force, a living legend who had spent a lifetime defying the odds, both on and off the screen. Eastwood had weathered more storms than most could ever imagine, but this wasn't just an interview. This was a personal confrontation, and every word Stephanopoulos threw at him was met with quiet resistance. The host was pushing too far, and Clint wasn't about to let the narrative be rewritten by someone who didn't understand the weight of the story. Stephanopoulos, feeling the need to press further, decided to take the conversation in a more personal direction. "Clint, you've been outspoken in the past, especially about certain leaders and movements. Some would argue that your comments have created division. You've made quite a few waves, especially with your comments during the Republican National Convention. You don't think that adds fuel to a fire, making the issues you care about even more complicated?" The words hung in the air, thick with accusation. Stephanopoulos' gaze was unwavering, but Clint, ever the stoic, wasn't fazed. The question wasn't just about politics anymore. It was an attack on his character, his views on leadership, his position as a public figure, and Clint knew it. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The polite interview had long been replaced with a calculated attempt to provoke a response. Clint, ever composed, leaned forward slightly, his hands resting casually on the armrests. "I made a point during that speech, George," Clint said, his voice low but clear. "It wasn't about mocking anyone. It wasn't about tearing anyone down. It was about speaking up for what I believe in, and I've always done that. I've never backed down from it." Stephanopoulos, sensing an opening, pressed again, his voice sharper now. "But Clint, what about the implications? When you challenge a sitting president or mock political figures, you're not just making a point anymore. You're making a statement that many people can't ignore. Don't you think that makes your message harder to accept for some?" Clint's eyes, cold and unyielding, met Stephanopoulos' with the intensity of someone who had spent his life in battles of far higher stakes than this. He had survived Hollywood's tough waters, built his career on grit and resilience. And now, he wasn't about to let a journalist redefine him in a single interview. "There's a difference, George," Clint said, his voice gaining strength, "between being disagreeable and standing for something. I don't need to please everyone. I never have. I speak my truth, and that's what matters. I'm not here to please the media or the critics. I'm here to tell a story, to honor the people who really matter. The teachers, the soldiers, the firefighters, the ones who step up, even when the world tells them to sit down." Clint's words were deliberate, and they carried weight. The silence that followed spoke volumes. There was no dramatic outburst, no explosion of anger. It was something much more powerful, an unwavering statement of principle. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone in the studio. Clint Eastwood wasn't just defending a film, he was defending the very essence of who he was. Stephanopoulos, still clinging to his narrative, tried once more. But Clint, with quiet confidence, had already shifted the power dynamics in the room. This wasn't a conversation about political divisions, it was about personal integrity. And Clint Eastwood had just shown the world that sometimes, silence speaks louder than words. The host, visibly flustered, could only manage a weak attempt to steer the conversation back on course. But the moment had passed. Clint had regained control, and there was no turning back. The tension in the studio was unbearable, hanging in the air like thick smoke, but Clint Eastwood remained calm. The unflinching icon who had spent a lifetime in front of cameras, on battlefields, and in political trenches, knew exactly how to handle the pressure. His composure was not just a testament to his years of experience, it was a declaration. George Stephanopoulos, for all his charm and journalistic prowess, had underestimated Clint's ability to not just deflect but to reclaim control when the situation called for it. For a moment, everything in the studio seemed to freeze. Stephanopoulos, sensing he had pushed too far, tried to shift the conversation again. But the damage had already been done. The subtle insinuations, the repeated attempts to provoke a reaction, Clint had seen through them all. The respect he had earned over decades in Hollywood, as a filmmaker, as an actor, and as a cultural icon, wasn't going to be tarnished by a late-night talk show host trying to manipulate the narrative. The interview had gone from an exchange of ideas to a battle for dominance, and Clint, with his quiet strength, had won. But there was more to be said. The camera zoomed in on Clint as he made his decision, slow but deliberate. He stood up, his movements controlled, every step measured like a man who had seen the storm and chosen to face it on his terms. "George," Clint said, his voice quiet but carrying across the set with undeniable power. "I came here to talk about the people who deserve to be celebrated, real heroes, those who quietly give everything without looking for applause. But this isn't what I signed up for." There was no anger in Clint's tone, just disappointment. The studio was silent, the crew frozen in place, unsure of what was unfolding before them. Stephanopoulos tried to respond, but Clint didn't give him the chance. He unclipped his microphone slowly, deliberately, as if to punctuate the point. Every motion was deliberate, no theatrics, no shouting, just a calm, unwavering walk toward the door. As Clint turned toward the exit, the audience remained still, processing what they had just witnessed. The legendary actor, having been pushed past his limits, had done something few could pull off. He had walked away from a situation that no longer deserved his time or dignity. There was no spectacle, no dramatic exit, just a man who had made a choice, and in that choice, he reclaimed his narrative. Back on stage, Stephanopoulos was left speechless. His professional composure faltered as he stared at the empty chair where Clint had just sat. The camera lingered on the empty seat, capturing the silence that had settled over the room. It was a powerful image, one that spoke volumes about the weight of Clint Eastwood's decision. In the control room, producers scrambled, unsure whether to cut to a commercial or let the silence speak for itself. Meanwhile, on social media, the news was already spreading. Clint Eastwood's walkout had become an instant viral moment. It wasn't just about an interview gone wrong, it was a message about integrity, dignity, and the cost of public life in an era of media manipulation. The impact of Clint's actions didn't fade with the closing credits. As the days passed, discussions about the interview swirled across social media, news outlets, and talk shows. Some hailed Clint as a hero for standing up for himself, while others debated whether his refusal to engage was a missed opportunity for meaningful dialogue. But the truth remained clear. Clint Eastwood had walked out not in anger, but in principle, reminding the world that integrity can't be bought, manipulated, or broken by a television show. For Clint, this moment wasn't about proving a point to anyone else, it was about standing by the values he had lived by his entire life. And in that, he had once again proven why he was, and would always be, a legend.